Hello, my name's Lance Butler. I'm giving a talk, recorded now, on T.S. Eliot and on his poem Little Gidding, in fact just on the first section of Little Gidding. And if you really want to get the full width of what I'm saying, you might be better to have a copy of that text in front of you, just the first section of Little Gidding if you can. But I'm going to read the poem anyway, but it might help you to follow a bit better. Okay, I'm at the Arthur Conan Doyle Centre in Edinburgh, where I do teach a bit of poetry and spirituality, and of course T.S. Eliot is one of the greatest spiritual poets in the English language, and remarkably, considering that most religious poetry, anyway, in English was written in the 17th and the 19th centuries. It's remarkable that T.S. Eliot didn't die until 1965 and is a modernist, but is a great spiritual poet, and the climax of his work in that direction, certainly, was the Four Quartets, of which Little Gidding is the last. They are poems about time, I think, in every possible meaning of that term, and in one particular meaning as well. I just want to say that if you were reading something like Milton or Homer or Chaucer, and I asked you, what are you reading? You'd probably say, I'm reading Homer or Milton or Chaucer. You wouldn't say, I'm reading poetry, even though they are in verse. And I think that's because we've very usefully limited the term poetry to cover simply lyric poetry, that is, basically quite short poems, very often focused on love, on nature, or on things spiritual. And Eliot is a kind of climax of that too. I mean, Shakespeare's plays are in verse, but you have to sort of make a little move in your mind to remember, well, I'm now studying Shakespeare's poetry, because poetry for us means these shorter poems. And I want to just say one thing about the characteristic of such poems, before I actually read the poem and then comment on it. It is that there's a thing in literature called overdetermination, which essentially means saying the same thing again and again and again in different ways. And rather strangely, it might sound boring, but rather strangely, it is the characteristic of lyric poetry, because overdetermination means that you say one thing and you say it again and you say it again in a poem whose meaning might be, say, I love you. Well, you can't go very far from that. In a novel, of course, I love you is followed by all sorts of adventures and misadventures. But in poetry, in the way we use the word poetry, it can only mean I love you and I love you and I love you. It depends how well it's said for whether the poem's worth reading or not. And it's a kind of dancing on the spot that lyric poetry offers, a dancing among a series of metaphors. If you take a famous love poem like Andrew Marvell's To His Coy Mistress, which begins, you probably know, had we but whirled enough and time, this coyness, lady, were no crime. That's the meaning of the poem. It means, I would love you for a long time, but time is short, so please can I love you now? And all the wonderful lines of that poem, all the way down to the grave's a fine and private place, but none I think do there embrace, are just saying the same thing again and again about time and love and making love. So I'm going to read this opening of Little Gidding, and I put it to you that the point is made in the first line, or the first line and a half, and the rest is a kind of brilliant dancing through a series of metaphors. So let's see if that works. Little Gidding, first section. Midwinter spring is its own season, sempiternal, though sodden towards sundown, suspended in time between pole and tropic, when the short day is brightest, with frost and fire, the brief sun flames the ice on pond and ditches, in windless cold that is the heart's heat, reflecting in a watery mirror, a glare that is blindness in the early afternoon. And glow, more intense than blaze of branch or brazier, stirs the dumb spirit. No wind, but Pentecostal fire in the dark time of the year. Between melting and freezing, the soul's sap quivers. There is no earth smell or smell of living thing. This is the springtime, but not in time's covenant. Now the hedgerow is blanched for an hour, with transitory blossom of snow, a bloom more sudden than that of summer, neither budding nor fading, not in the scheme of generation. Where is the summer, the unimaginable, zero summer? If you came this way, taking the route you would be likely to take, from the place you would be likely to come from, if you came this way in May time, you would find the hedges white again in May, with voluptuary sweetness. It would be the same at the end of the journey if you came at night, like a broken king. If you came by day, not knowing what you came for, it would be the same. When you leave the rough road and turn behind the pigsty to the dull facade and the tombstone. And what you thought you came for is only a shell, a husk of meaning, from which the purpose breaks only when it is fulfilled, if at all. Either you had no purpose, or the purpose is beyond the end you figured, and is altered in fulfilment. There are other places which also are the world's end, some at the sea jaws, or over a dark lake in a desert or a city. But this is the nearest, in place and time, now, and in England. If you came this way, taking any route, starting from anywhere, at any time or any season, it would always be the same. You would have to put off sense and notion. You are not here to verify, instruct yourself, or inform curiosity or carry report. You are here to kneel, where prayer has been valid. And prayer is more than an order of words, the conscious occupation of the praying mind, or the sound of the voice praying. And what the dead had no speech for when living, they can tell you, being dead. The communication of the dead is tongued with fire beyond the language of the living. Here, the intersection of the timeless moment is England and nowhere, never and always. Well, you must all have had the experience of finding T.S. Eliot a bit hard to follow. Not, as it were, the words, necessarily, the clauses, the sentences, but it's hard to know what exactly he's getting at. Indeed, of course, there's a line in Eliot, one of his other poems, in which he talks about, understanding the words but missing the meaning. And you feel, well, I can see there's a lot of meaning in there, but I'm not quite sure that I've got it. He seems to be elusive like that. But I put it to you that if you think of this poem in terms of overdetermination, in terms of dancing on the spot, running on the spot, saying the same thing again and again, it does make perfect sense. The metaphors fit together. Well, there it is at the beginning, stating what it means. Midwinter, spring, of course, that's completely impossible. The spring is not midwinter, midwinter is not spring. Is its own season? Well, sure it is. We'd never heard of it before. And it's sempiternal, though sodden towards sundown. Well, of course what he's thinking of is the day in 1936, I think he wrote this poem in 1942, but the day in 1936 when he went to Little Gidding in Cambridgeshire, a very small village with an old church, where in the 17th century a group of Anglicans, rather tired of the religious conflicts of their time, decided they would live a quiet, semi-cloistered Anglican life, a couple of brothers and some of their friends and their wives. And it seems like a kind of gem in Anglican history of a real attempt to be Christians in that particular version of Christianity. And a kind of magic moment, I suppose. And so it's a little place where a little thing, or a very, very big thing, happened for a little time. It's small against the history of Christianity. It's small against the history of England. Just like a day in midwinter when you catch the sun, when the sun shines, suddenly in the frosty, the snowy day with the low temperature, there you are out for your walk and there's no wind. There's still days. And for some reason, instead of being grey and wet, the sun shines. And of course the sun shines low, and it's clearly reflected off the snow, off the icy pond. In fact, it's very bright. You shade your eyes, partly because the sun is low, and partly because it's so bright, so that suddenly you're in, as it were, the wrong season. It's a little moment in the middle of a big season, or a big year, or a big lifetime, when suddenly you are unexpectedly illuminated. And look at that word at the beginning of the second line. It's not just semper, the Latin forever. It's not just eternal, which also comes from the Latin for forever. It's sempiternal. It's eternally eternal. Wow, wait a minute. I thought it was just a short moment in time that we were meeting here. Is there something funny about time, whereby in the midst of a rather short winter's day, to be followed by rather a long winter's night, let us hope, by the fire, there is a moment, an unexpected moment, an instant perhaps, of something quite different, something which shows another meaning. And he says it. You're suspended in time between pole and tropic. You think, wait a minute, this is the shortest day. This is sort of almost no day at all, but look how bright it is suddenly. What's that symbolic of? The short day is brightest, with frost and fire. Good heavens, there's fire, and the brief sun flames on ponds and ditches in windless cold. You've got the sun flaming, so the sun's doing the wrong thing, just as the winter's day is doing the wrong thing, just as these instants of time are not the same time as ordinary time. Perhaps they are moments of spiritual time. The heart's heat suddenly appears. So you get these words, don't you, like sempiternal, or flames, or the heart's heat. Whew, this is quite a big claim for what you feel on one of those walks, I don't know, a Boxing Day walk after lunch. It is the afternoon here, where suddenly you think, whoa, look at that winter sun. Oh, what am I seeing here? And of course, he's going to call it a glare that is blindness. Because of course, in a sense, when there's too much light of any kind, you can't see anything at all, so there's a kind of paradox there. And the glare of the sun, you understand, you think, well, I didn't bring when I came to stay with these people in the country, I didn't bring my dark glasses. I wasn't expecting a sun like this, but I wish I had my dark glasses. Look at the glare, the sudden thing that's happening to me. And in the early afternoon, there's a glow, which is more intense than blaze of branch or brazier. The burning bush, I don't know, the burning branch of the fire you're going back to, the brazier where the man in the town roasts chestnuts for you in the dead of winter, hoping to charge you too much for them, and you're hoping that not all of them are rotten. The glow stirs. See, this glow is not a verb, it's a noun. The glow more intense stirs the dumb spirit. That's you, that's me, that's the dumb spirit. For once, the Pentecostal fires, which are of course tongues of fire, are going to speak, and we, even in our dumb spirits, are going to speak, or at least be stirred. So he says, no wind, we know the sort of day we're talking about, but Pentecostal fire. There's another of those words. What on earth is Pentecost doing here? By now, you should easily be able to understand the basic trope, the basic series of metaphors, the basic meaning, in other words, that where there is utter cold, there can be Pentecostal fire. Where there is the silence of the Spirit, there can be the tongues of Pentecost. And if you remember, the apostles start speaking in tongues at Pentecost. They speak in different languages they don't know. So it's a sentence in the language you don't know, a tiny, mad thing in the middle of the enormous raft of words in languages that you do know, with which your life is normally filled in the dark time of the year. Between melting and freezing, the soul's sap quivers. And there we have it. What he's going to switch on to now is what we normally do. What we normally do is nature. And I suppose these magic moments are, if you like the word, supernatural, spiritual, from the beyond, from another side. So he goes into it. He goes into the plant life. The sap quivers. But not the sap you're used to, the sap in the tree, the sap of your life, the sap of your blood, but the Spirit's sap, which is a different thing, from a different order of being. So there is no earth smell, no smell of living things. I mean, what more naturally natural than the smell of things, the smell of the springtime, the smell of rotting leaves, but of course this is midwinter, so there's no smell. Those low temperatures don't permit the transference of whatever it is in the air that makes smells. This is the springtime. Wait a minute, no it isn't. Oh, but not in time's covenant. There's another of the words. Covenant in modern English only has one meaning, and it's the biblical meaning, isn't it? The covenant between Jehovah and the Jews, or between God and Christians after Jesus, the deal that we're going to be all right as long as we do the right things because of his love and so on. It's a deal, a covenant, you understand? As in sort of last will and testament is a covenant in a way, isn't it? This is the springtime, but not the usual springtime. Because now the hedgerow is blanched for an hour with transitory blossom. And the trick here, of course, is that if you look at blackthorn, it's interesting, it's called blackthorn. In the spring, it's gone white. And that white is known as May. It's rather interesting. If you look at the May, you mean look at the blossom on the blackthorn. And interestingly, the blackthorn has very white blossom, and of course it smells delicious. And you probably remember that in the very first volume of Proust, at Cambrai, he's going up to see the house where Gilberte, as a teenager, I think, lives. And he's standing by the hedge. And, things are about to explode in his life and in his mind, let's say in his soul. And he smells the aubépine, he smells that wonderful, rich, heady smell of May, of the blossoming blackthorn. And it's one of the very earliest of the Proustian moments in that great novel. Now the hedgerow is blanched for an hour, it's a transitory blossom of snow, a bloom more sudden. It's sudden, it's a quick thing, it's a short thing than that of summer, neither budding nor fading. There you have it. All other buds, our bodies, our lives, our children, bud and fade. You know that the spring comes, and you know that autumn is not that far behind, especially here in Scotland. And then it's winter, and there's no more budding or fading. And of course, at the end of the next line, you see what he's talking about. Generation, as in the sense of generations of people, the generating of people through natural causes, sex and so on. The generation of animals and plants through the rhythm of the years. Warms up, life comes back, cools down, life goes away. That is the scheme of generation in our time, the time of our covenant, but not in the time he's talking about, his brief visit to little Gidding. And he asks, where is the summer, the unimaginable zero summer? That's an incomprehensible series of words, I think. It's meant to be deliberately defeating. I mean, what would you have in summer? It wouldn't be a zero summer, because summer goes on for a bit. But he's talking about moments in time, the zero summer. Would there be zero temperature in summer? No, it's incomprehensible. He's stopping you short at the end of this to make you think, I think, about the season that he's in, midwinter, spring. So here he is, at that moment in time, in that place, talking about moments in time and little spaces in place. So he says, well, whoever you are, and he says it beautifully, doesn't he? I mean, if you came this way, taking the route you would be likely to take, it means nothing, does it? I mean, what you're going to take whatever route you take, so what, from the place you would be likely to come from. In other words, whoever you are, if you came this way in May time, and that first May, there's a May in the next line, has a small letter, what do you call it? Not a capital letter, because May time is the time of the blossom of the thorn bushes, and you would find the hedges white again in May. That's in the month of May. By the way, up here in June, up here in Scotland, the May tends to come out in June, which I always think is quite funny. And as you know, the smell of those lovely little flowers has a voluptuary sweetness. Boy, voluptuary sweetness. I mean, that's an overdetermination in itself of things rich and fleshly and earthly and valuable, the incredible smells or the incredible beauty of nature, the voluptuary sweetness. But it would be the same. You came in May, you'd see it all covered, but in a different kind of white, the sort of long-term generation, delicious smells, sensual white, not the frozen instant white of ice and snow or of the strange light that's now covering the countryside. And you leave the rough road, that's what you're going to do. You're going to go round by the pigsty and the boring wall, the dull facade. Oh, and of course there's a church here, so there's a tombstone. You know where you're going here. I mean, this is, May, spring, autumn, into death, the tombstone, and what you thought you came for is only a husk. So whatever you're doing is in some sense for him only a husk, unless it's informed by spirit. It's rather like St. Paul in Corinthians 13, talking about you can do all these things, but if you have not love, you have not charity, it cannot be reckoned, so it's not worth anything. The husk of meaning. So you have meaning. I'm on a tourist visit to remote Cambridgeshire. We've seen the university, now we're looking at this famous little village. Yes, now what is this? And you've got something, but it's only the shell or the husk of meaning, and the purpose will only break for it when it's fulfilled. What would that be? Christianity offers, of course, to fulfill human destiny in a particular way, the way of sacrifice and love. Anyway, there you are. Either you've had no purpose, you were just wandering around, or the purpose is beyond what you were aiming to do, and it's going to change when you get there. You know that, don't you? I mean, you're looking forward to something, and when it happens, it's always different from what you expect. Luckily, if you're fearing something, it's usually different from what you expect, because everything's always different from what you expect, except the really real thing, which, for Eliot is going to be, that instant of spirit. And he says, look, you can find these things elsewhere. They also are at the world's end. You see, that's all it is. It's the world's end, because the world is nature. The world is the universe. The world is the seasons. Now, here, now and in England for this moment, he's at the world's end. He's not, he's in Cambridgeshire. But he's at the end of what the world can offer, what normal time provides. He's stepping to the other side, I suppose, opening his heart, where heart is not the appropriate metaphor, to God. Dark lake, desert or city, but this is the nearest. Why? Because you're here now. And of course, we know the paradox, the strange thing about eternity. It's always now, but so is our time. Our time is always now. As I speak to you, it's now. When I finish, it'll still be now, and tomorrow it'll still be now. Read Eckhart Tolle, The Power of Now. You know where I'm coming from. Now and in England. So he tries you again. If you came this way taking any route, you can be a Buddhist or a Hindu or an atheist or a communist or whatever it is, starting from anywhere, any time, any season, it would always be the same. You would have to put off sense and notion. Now, sense, well, those are the five senses. So you've got to stop. The five senses are the things with which we apprehend nature. You have to stop apprehending nature, stop feeling and seeing and all that. And put off, of course, is Renaissance English for taking off your clothes. He put off his clothes. You get it in the authorised version in Shakespeare and so on. So that put off is not delay. It means divest yourself. You have to divest yourself of sense, feelings, interactions with the world, and notion. All your ideas. So would you please leave your ideas and your senses and your emotions at the door? Here, in the church at Little Gidding, I don't know, looking at the pond as the sun goes down over it. At this moment, this moment here and now and in England, you've put off sense and notion. Leave it outside, because you're not here to verify. You're not checking up. I'll just go to church and see if God's still there. That kind of thing. You're not here for instruction or to inform your curiosity or carry a report. You're not here to go back afterwards and say, yep, I had a really good experience. Let me tell you all about it. Because, of course, all that is in ordinary time. You are here to kneel. Well, of course, the Anglicans who set up the little community at Little Gidding knelt a lot, and people in different religions bow and kneel and prostrate themselves. And it symbolises stasis. You can't walk when you're kneeling. You can't fulfill the ordinary purposes of life on your knees. You can only fulfill one purpose, and that's a vertical one, I suppose you could say, where prayer has been valid. People have found spirit here before those Anglicans in the 17th century. And prayer is in more than an order of words. The conscious occupation of the praying mind. It's more than these things. It's not just what you're thinking. It's not the sound of your voice. It's what the dead had no speech for when living. No human can really do prayer, just as when you're trying to meditate and you're supposed to be meditating with no mind or with total emptiness, you do spend most of your time thinking about meditating with empty mind and with nothingness. The communication of the dead, however, what they know is tongued with fire. There's Pentecost again. Beyond the language of the living. Look, it's quite a simple poem, isn't it? It's beyond the language of the living. You know that. You know that in some sense the great mystics end up not being able to say what they want to say because you can't say it, you know. And here they are at the intersection of eternity and ordinary time, the intersection of the timeless moment. It's one of many oxymorons in this poem, the timeless moment. Well, the moment can't be timeless. Everything I've said about instants of time and little things, of course, is wrong. The instant of time is in fact nothing, and the place is nowhere, is England nowhere, never and always, these contradictions. I want to go back to a point that I didn't comment on before I finish, and that is the enigmatic presence in the second paragraph here of the broken king. Well, you need to know a bit of history, but you'll see that even this reference to King Charles I fulfills the same metaphorical purpose as every other part of the poem and merely overdetermines, reinforces the meaning. It so happens that during the Civil War, as King Charles was losing numbers of battles, when he lost the Battle of Naseby, which is not far from here in East Anglia, not far from Little Gidding, he and some of his troops escaped back to Little Gidding, which he knew to be a sort of royalist stronghold in only a small village, where at least he knew there was this Anglican place. And presumably he said a few prayers. So here's the broken king. And if you think about it, if you're king in the 17th century, think of Louis XIV or something, you're absolute monarch appointed by God. So you have what you might call exactly the wrong kind of religion, in that you think God wants you to do all this living and all this pomp and circumstance that goes with being a king, and all this condemning people to death and declaring wars and arguing about taxes, and it's life, God help us. And then you lose a battle, and suddenly it all stops. It's a moment when you might very well think, so what's this all for? Is there another reality against which I should be measuring it? So it applies to us, and it applies to the saints and the mystics, and it applies to King Charles I, who of course will have another terrible moment a couple of years later when he is executed, where he showed both bravery and good humour, perhaps able then to see that things don't matter as much as we think they do in time, because there's another time, there's something else. Well, that's that one. Thank you very much for listening.